Inspired by situations like those shared online, this is a fictional story. I never thought the hardest day of my life would happen twice. The first time was when I held my 16-year-old son Ethan in the middle of Maple Ridge Drive after a drunk driver ignored a stop sign and stole every plan we'd ever made together. And the second was the afternoon I watched security footage of someone kneeling in my front yard, calmly removing the little bronze memorial I built for him before tossing it into a trash bin like it was yesterday's junk mail. My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm 47 years old, and I spend most of my days repairing fiber optic lines across western Colorado. It's honest work, long hours, muddy boots, coffee that tastes like burnt dirt, and enough climbing to remind me every morning that my knees aren't 25 anymore. After my wife passed away from cancer when Ethan was 9, it was just the two of us. We weren't the kind of family that took fancy vacations or posted perfect Christmas photos online. We fixed old trucks together, grilled burgers on Sundays, argued over baseball, and somehow managed to laugh through bills that always seemed a little higher than my paycheck. Ethan had this habit of making every broken thing look reparable. If a lawnmower quit running, he'd pull it apart on the garage floor. If the mailbox leaned after a snowstorm, he'd grab a shovel before I even got home from work. That mailbox became our little project one spring weekend. We poured fresh concrete, sanded cedar boards until our hands hurt, painted the post dark walnut, then stood there admiring it like we'd built a skyscraper. He looked over at me and grinned. Not bad for two guys who watched 3 YouTube videos first. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my drill. That's the memory I kept replaying after he died because somehow my mind refused to replay the hospital. It wanted the garage, the sawdust, the smell of fresh paint, his stupid jokes, the sound of him singing off-key to classic rock while pretending he actually knew the words. Grief is strange like that. It doesn't hit you all at once. It sneaks into ordinary moments. You open the refrigerator and realize nobody drank the orange juice. You hear a truck door slam outside and expect footsteps that never come. You catch yourself buying his favorite barbecue chips without thinking, then stand frozen in aisle 6 wondering how your own brain can betray you like that. About 8 months after the accident, I finally felt strong enough to do something I'd been putting off. I ordered a simple bronze plaque. Nothing flashy. No giant monument. No dramatic sculpture. Just his name, his birthday, the day we lost him, and one sentence. You made this world brighter than you ever knew. I mounted it beside the mailbox we'd built together because that corner of the yard belonged to us long before it belonged to any homeowners association. Every morning before work, I'd rest my hand on it for a second. I never prayed much, but somehow those few seconds became my conversation with Ethan. Sometimes I'd tell him work was exhausting. Sometimes I'd complain about gas prices. Sometimes I'd apologize because I still couldn't bring myself to clean out his bedroom. It wasn't about religion. It was about still being a dad, even after the world decided I wasn't supposed to be one anymore. Then, exactly 2 days after installing the plaque, I got an email from the Homeowners Association. Subject line: Architectural Violation Notice. I actually laughed before opening it because I figured maybe they'd noticed my fence needed paint. Instead, I read, Unauthorized memorial displays are inconsistent with neighborhood visual standards and must be removed within 48 hours to maintain community uniformity. That was it. No, we're sorry for your loss. No, please contact us if you need assistance. Just policy numbers and deadlines, like they were talking about garbage cans left out after pickup day. I called the office. Straight to voicemail. I sent an email explaining that the plaque honored my son, who had died less than a mile from our subdivision entrance. I even attached the police report because somehow I thought facts might inspire compassion. Nothing. 2 days passed without a single response. My next-door neighbor, Frank, stopped while walking his golden retriever and asked how I was holding up. I showed him the notice. He read it twice before shaking his head. Danny, some folks confuse having authority with having a heart. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe somebody on the board will come around. Frank didn't answer. He just sighed, patted my shoulder, and walked home. Looking back now, I think he already knew better than I did. Thursday started like every other workday. Alarm at 5. Coffee before sunrise. 12 hours tracing damaged cable after a windstorm knocked out service across 3 counties. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky had turned orange, and all I wanted was a shower and a frozen pizza. Then something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it immediately. The yard looked normal. The flowers my late wife planted years ago still lined the walkway. The flag by the porch moved gently in the evening breeze. But there was an emptiness that hit me before my eyes figured it out. I walked toward the mailbox, and my stomach dropped. The plaque was gone, for tiny screw holes stared back at me from the cedar post. That's all that remained. For one awful second it felt exactly like standing in that emergency room again, your mind refusing to believe what your eyes already know. Before I could even process it, Frank came jogging across the lawn holding his phone. His face had gone pale. "Danny," he said quietly, "I think you need to see this." My hands were already shaking as he pressed play. The video began with nothing but a timestamp and the quiet hum of Frank's Ring camera. Then a white SUV rolled into view and stopped in front of my house. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Sharon Whitmore, the president of the Cedar Hollow HOA. I'd seen her 100 times before, always dressed like she was headed to a city council meeting instead of a neighborhood barbecue. Perfectly pressed slacks, oversized sunglasses, clipboard tucked under one arm like it was part of her anatomy. She looked both ways, walked across my lawn without the slightest hesitation, knelt beside the mailbox Ethan and I had built together, and pulled a screwdriver from her pocket. I watched her loosen every screw with the same calm expression someone might have while changing batteries in a smoke detector. There wasn't a second of doubt on her face, not one glance toward my front door, not one pause that suggested she understood she was touching something sacred. When the plaque finally came free, she looked at it for maybe 2 seconds, muttered something the camera couldn't quite catch, then walked to the curb and dropped it into the blue recycling bin. The metallic clank echoed through Frank's phone speaker, and somehow that tiny sound hurt more than anything I'd heard since the hospital. Frank reached over and paused the video. "Danny, say something." I couldn't. My throat felt locked shut. Instead, I walked over to the recycling bin, lifted the lid, and dug through cardboard, soda cans, and yesterday's newspapers until my fingers found the cold bronze. It had scratches across one corner, and there was dried coffee grounds smeared over Ethan's name. I wiped it clean with my shirt without realizing tears had started running down my face. I sat inside my truck for nearly an hour after that. The engine never started. The windows slowly fogged over while the sun disappeared behind the mountains. At first, I imagined marching over to Sharon's house and screaming until the whole subdivision came outside. Then I imagined throwing the violation letter back at her front door. Then I imagined absolutely nothing. Eventually, the anger settled into something colder, something quieter. My father used to tell me that the most dangerous people aren't the loud ones. They're the ones who stop yelling because they've started thinking. I pulled out my phone and made a list. Save every email. Download Frank's video. Photograph the damage. Call an attorney. No revenge. No threats. Just facts. By 10 that night, my dining room table looked like a detective's office. I printed every HOA email, highlighted dates, organized photographs, copied neighborhood bylaws, and read every page of the association's governing documents. Somewhere around midnight, I found what I was looking for. The board could issue violation notices, but nowhere did it authorize board members to enter private property and remove personal belongings. They hadn't enforced a rule. They'd crossed a property line. The next morning, I called a local attorney named Rebecca Sloan. Her receptionist almost apologized because Rebecca was booked solid for weeks. But after hearing one sentence, "The HOA president removed my son's memorial from my yard," she put me on hold. Less than 5 minutes later, Rebecca herself picked up. She didn't sound like a lawyer looking for another client. She sounded like someone trying very hard to stay calm. "Mr. Brooks," she said softly, "my younger brother was killed by a drunk driver 12 years ago. Come in this afternoon. We'll figure this out." Sometimes life sends you exactly the right person at exactly the moment you're about to give up. Rebecca listened without interrupting. She watched the ring footage twice. Then she leaned back in her chair and said something I'll never forget. "This isn't about a plaque anymore. This is about someone believing power excuses cruelty." She explained that we had several possible claims, including trespass, property damage, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. But then she surprised me. "Winning in court is one thing," she said. "Changing behavior is another. People like this survive because nobody shines a light on what they're doing." She slid a legal pad toward me. "Who knows this story besides your neighbors?" I shrugged. "Nobody." She smiled just a little. "Let's change that." Over the next 2 days, we built a timeline so detailed it could have been used in a criminal investigation. Frank signed a witness statement. Another neighbor admitted she'd seen Sharon walking through my yard that afternoon, but assumed she'd asked permission. Rebecca drafted demand letters. I organized every photograph from the day Ethan and I built that mailbox because it proved the memorial sat entirely inside my private landscaping, not on common HOA property. Then Rebecca asked one final question. Would you be willing to tell your story on camera? I hesitated. I hated attention. I'd spent my entire career fixing things behind the scenes, while everyone else enjoyed working internet and television. But this wasn't really about me anymore. If Sharon felt comfortable doing this to my family, who would she do it to next? An elderly widow? A veteran? Someone too intimidated to push back? I nodded. Yeah, I said. I'll talk. Rebecca sent carefully prepared press packets to television stations, newspapers, and community watchdog reporters across the state. She didn't exaggerate a single fact because she didn't need to. The truth was painful enough. 48 hours later, my phone started vibrating before sunrise. Unknown numbers. Reporters. Producers. One wanted an interview. Another wanted copies of the security footage. A third simply asked, is it true the HOA president personally removed a memorial for a teenager killed by a drunk driver? By 9 that morning, there were news vans parked outside the subdivision entrance. By lunchtime, there were 5. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks holding coffee cups, whispering to one another. People I'd barely spoken to in years walked over and quietly shook my hand. One woman hugged me without saying a word. Cameras pointed toward the clubhouse while Sharon tried slipping inside through a side entrance. It didn't work. Reporters surrounded her. Did you personally remove the memorial? One asked. Do you regret your actions? Another shouted. She forced a smile that looked painfully rehearsed. The association simply follows established architectural standards, she replied. Personal feelings cannot override community guidelines. Standing 30 yards away, I remember thinking those might be the most expensive words she'd ever speak. Then everything got even bigger. That evening, an anonymous envelope arrived at one reporter's office containing screenshots from the HOA board's private group chat. Nobody officially admitted who leaked them, but judging by the panic that followed, someone inside had finally reached their limit. One message from Sharon froze the entire room during the evening broadcast. If residents start decorating with grief, property values will suffer. Another read. Sympathy doesn't belong in the bylaws. The final screenshot was the one nobody could stop talking about. His loss isn't the community's responsibility. The internet exploded within hours. Thousands of comments poured in from people who'd lost children, spouses, parents, and friends. They weren't arguing about landscaping anymore. They were talking about empathy, authority, and what kind of people we choose to become when nobody tells us no. As I sat alone in my living room watching the coverage, Rebecca called. Daniel, she said, don't be surprised if they try to settle quietly tomorrow. I looked out the front window at the empty mailbox where Ethan's plaque belonged. It's too late for quiet, I answered. That ended the moment she threw my son into the trash. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening, but by the time Rebecca and I pulled into the clubhouse parking lot, it already looked nothing like a routine HOA meeting. Television cameras lined the sidewalk, neighbors filled every available chair inside the building, and dozens more stood outside watching through the windows. I'd lived in Cedar Hollow for almost 11 years, and I'd never seen the community gathered like that. Usually people showed up to complain about fences, weeds, or parking spaces. This time they were there because everyone had finally realized something much bigger than landscaping had happened. Sharon walked into the room surrounded by 2 board members, but the confidence she'd carried for years was gone. Her shoulders were stiff, her smile had disappeared, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked like someone who understood she couldn't control the room anymore. The meeting barely lasted 5 minutes before residents started speaking. An elderly veteran stood first. My wife passed away 3 years ago, he said. There's a small wind chime in my backyard with her name on it. Are you planning to throw that away too? A young mother followed. If my daughter died tomorrow, would I need board approval to remember her? Then Frank slowly walked to the microphone holding a printed photograph of the bronze plaque covered in coffee grounds after we pulled it from the recycling bin. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held up the picture and said, "This is what happens when rules matter more than people." You could have heard a pin drop. Sharon finally stood and adjusted the microphone. I understand emotions are running high, she began. But the board has always enforced community standards equally. Before she could continue, Rebecca calmly placed a folder on the table in front of every board member. Inside were the legal claims we'd prepared, copies of the governing documents, still photographs from Frank's security camera, and transcripts of the leaked messages that had already spread across the state. Sharon flipped through the pages, and I watched the color leave her face one sheet at a time. She looked up at Rebecca. "Those messages were private." Rebecca answered without changing her expression. "Your decision to enter Mr. Brooks' property wasn't." A low murmur spread through the room. One of the other board members, a retired accountant named Harold, slowly removed his glasses and sighed. "We were never told you personally removed the memorial," he said, looking directly at Sharon. She tried to respond, but another board member interrupted her. Then another. Within minutes, the people who had spent years voting beside her were questioning every decision she'd made. It was almost surreal to watch. For years, she'd controlled every meeting with absolute certainty. Now she couldn't finish a sentence without someone asking another uncomfortable question. Finally, the association's attorney stood and quietly advised the board that continuing to defend the action would expose the HOA to significant legal and financial risk. The room fell silent again. A motion was made to restore the memorial immediately. Another motion followed to issue a formal written apology to my family. Then came the final vote asking for Sharon's resignation as board president. Every hand except hers went up. She looked around the room as though she expected someone to rescue her, but nobody spoke. Without another word, she removed the nameplate from the table, slipped it into her folder, and walked out the side door, while camera flashes lit up the windows. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. It wasn't that kind of victory. A week later, the board invited residents back for a special meeting where they approved a new policy protecting small personal memorials placed on private property, provided they were safe and respectful. Several neighbors suggested naming it after Ethan. I thanked them, but I asked for something simpler. "Call it the Compassion Amendment," I said, because this was never just about my son. They agreed. 2 Saturdays later, I carried the bronze plaque back to the mailbox Ethan and I had built together. Frank showed up with his toolbox before I even asked. The young family from across the street brought fresh flowers. The veteran brought a small American flag. Nobody made speeches. Nobody needed to. I held the plaque in both hands for a long moment before tightening the final screw. The bronze caught the afternoon sunlight, and for the first time in months, it felt like something inside me finally stopped fighting. I rested my hand against Ethan's name and smiled through tears. "There you go, buddy," I whispered. "You're home again." Sometimes people ask if I hate Sharon for what happened. The truth is, I don't spend much time thinking about her anymore. Anger is heavy, and I've carried enough weight for one lifetime. But I do hope she remembers that afternoon every time she hears someone talk about leadership, because real leadership isn't measured by perfectly trimmed lawns or spotless sidewalks. It's measured by whether people feel safe enough to grieve, to heal, and to remain human in the place they call home. If this story made you think, I'd really like to hear your opinion. Did the HOA have any right to enforce its rules the way it did, or should compassion always come before regulations? Leave your thoughts in the comments because conversations like this matter. Share this story with someone who believes communities should protect people before appearances. And if you enjoy real-life inspired stories about justice, resilience, and standing up for what's right, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.